Multicultural Education, Raising Awareness, Changing Attitudes. Every child needs to feel welcome, to feel comfortable, says Sonia Nieto. At the beginning of the school year, I noticed that not all of my students were equally welcome in my classroom. There were power and status distinctions among my 8th grade ESL students. In particular, I had one student, let's call her Aria, who was reluctant to identify with her Mexican heritage because of, I inferred, the negative stereotypes about being Mexican. She feared being typecast and losing power. Aria also looked down on another student, Elena, who was more Mexican. Elena spoke more Spanish and had arrived in the U.S. recently. This lower status was communicated in subtle ways, in whom the students greeted when they entered the classroom, and who they partnered up with, in who they looked at when they were speaking, and in other conversational patterns. There was a tendency to disregard or diminish Elena's presence. The language part of Elena's culture had lowered her esteem in her peers' eyes. As Nieto points out, language is power. Seeing this, I wanted to make a change for these students. I wanted to use Nieto's work and her 5 tenets of sociocultural and sociopolitical theory to write and teach a unit that influenced my students' views and made them feel comfortable in their own skin and in our classroom. I wanted to help each girl build a positive self-identity and honor that of the other. I used TESOL Standard 2 extensively as I developed the unit. Specifically, I used TESOL's list of the content of culture to develop my students' study of their heritage. You will see this in a graphic organizer in slide 7. Through this project, I also sought to address the cultural conflict in my classroom, an outcome stated in TESOL Standard 2. I began with Nieto's identity tenet. I surveyed my students using the Student Heritage and Language interview. I wanted to know how they viewed their language and heritage. To my surprise, all of my students evidenced minimal awareness of their heritage. Interestingly, Aria left the heritage question blank. This was evidence of either her ignorance of her Mexican heritage or evidence of her negative view of it. I saw my first task as being that of helping the students learn about their heritage. I also wanted to gauge my students' biases and identify stereotypes they might hold. Fellow graduate student Jennifer Keogh kindly gave me permission to adapt and use her student survey. My students completed it. I found that while they had a good grasp of racism, they reported limited understandings of the other key terms, including culture, ethnicity, stereotyping, and multiculturalism. The survey provoked discussion, and I found that my students were not aware of the diversity of religions, ethnicities, nor sexual and gender preferences that existed. Again, my first job would be one of educating them. We began with, why does heritage matter? We watched anthropologist Elizabeth Lindsay's TED Talk called Curating Humanity's Heritage. I wanted to give my students an anchor piece for understanding the components of culture and give them one person's, Miss Lindsay's, powerful and poetic argument for the importance of heritage. As we watched Miss Lindsay, we completed this Heritage and Components of Culture worksheet for Miss Lindsay's side. After class discussion and questions, I felt the students had a good understanding of Lindsay's heritage and views. They were ready to give their own heritage a deeper look. I also felt it was important to walk my talk. As Diane Stairfenner writes, in addition to teachers examining their own beliefs around language and instruction for ELs, it is also important for them to take a closer look at their own cultures that they bring to their role as teachers and administrators. To this end, the students and I researched to complete the Your Heritage side of the sheet. The students spoke with their parents and other family members to gather the information, as well as bouncing ideas off of each other in class. This comparing and contrasting of cultures helped them to know themselves more deeply and provoked interesting discussions of everything from family structure and birth order to expectations and career paths. At this point, I felt the students had a firmer grasp on their own heritage and was gratified to see evidence of Aria owning her Mexican heritage too. While we were completing the Your Heritage side of the worksheet, she initiated a conversation in Spanish with Elena, something she had not done in the past. Now that the students had a grasp on their own heritage, I want to help them see and understand the diversity in our school and community. We began by defining the key terms they didn't understand and giving examples in class discussion. These included ethnicity, it helped to contrast this with race, stereotype, bias, and transgenderism. The students then wrote a journal entry about which topic most interested them at this point. These journal entries helped me decide in which order to teach the content. I started with the high interest topics, and also served to help me know my students' background knowledge. Tenet targeted, agency, and co-constructed learning. During this discussion, it also became clear that my students needed some guidance on how to discuss controversial topics diplomatically. While we were discussing transgenderism, one student cut another off saying, "No, Jamie, it's not like that at all, and continued to tell Jamie how it was, brooking no disagreement. Especially with the sensitive issues we would be discussing, I wanted a classroom where students were empowered through their collaboration, like Jim Cummins describes. Collaborative relations of power are based on the assumption that power can be generated in interpersonal and intergroup relations. Participants in the relationships are empowered through their collaboration. To this end, the students and I brainstormed this list of discussion norms to which we would adhere during our class discussions. I want to highlight number 5, disagree nicely. When we came up with this one, we also talked about ways to do this, such as, have you ever considered, or what about? Over the course of the next few weeks, we discussed stereotypes and how several groups are stereotyped. I used clips from the movie Grease to introduce the concept. The students then connected the notion of stereotype to our school. They made connections particularly with regard to where students sit at lunch. Over the course of the coming weeks, we expanded the topic to include other groups who are stereotyped. The students were very interested in transgenderism, which led to research on what the law states with regard to transgender individuals' rights and what school policy is. Thereafter followed a heated debate about what bathroom is appropriate for transgender individuals to use, and it revealed differences of opinion and comfort levels on the part of the students. The students also brought in images that they thought would provoke stereotyping in their classmates. These included images of people of different genders, races, religions, ethnicities, and social classes. The image study was revelatory. For example, one student showed this image to the class. At first, the student said that the woman was depressed. They based this solely on her facial expression. After a discussion on Islam and the stereotyping that many Muslims face after 9/11, the student said that the woman was successful. They substantiated this claim by arguing that she was on the internet and would probably have her message against stereotyping heard by many. Others said she was probably depressed because of the stereotyping that she and other Muslims have to face. As you can see, their thinking became more nuanced as they learned more. My students and I are currently enjoying Thanksgiving break, but this unit of study isn't done. My students still have many questions about the topics listed here. Their interest in these issues hasn't surprised me, but their lack of background knowledge has. However, they have good intentions and are open to learning and supporting their friends and community members. On their student surveys, all but one agreed with the statement, "I have a responsibility to create change in my community." I have a responsibility to help them do so. I believe I have evidence that the project reached its aim. First, Aria is claiming her Mexican heritage as evidenced by her use of Spanish and other indications that she is warming to that identity. There is also evidence that she accepted and befriended her Mexican peer. As mentioned earlier, She spoke Spanish during our heritage discussion. Elena moved away at the end of October, but before moving, she and Arya exchanged Instagram contact information and cell numbers. The girls in my class were talking just last week about how Elena now has bangs. They are keeping in touch. Third, I want to highlight the effectiveness of our discussion norms. The students own these and have become adept at calling each other out by pointing at the poster and saying, you should take a look at norm number X right now. These three outcomes are generalizable to other classes and to students' lives. I feel proud of this unit of study and will continue it as my students are engaged and they are developing that fifth tenet of Sonia Nieto's, a community in which they are growing and learning from and with each other. Here are my references.